Hi, everybody. Welcome to Hebrews chapter 5. We're going to keep moving on, but I want to give just a brief overview of what we've been studying. And if you see on our document on the left side of the screen, there's already a review written for you. So, what it says is the Son is better than the angels. And if you'll remember from chapters 1 and 2, the Hebrew writer made a really big deal about the Son being better than the angels and how he was made lower than the angels, but he was raised above them and he was made better than them. He was given a more excellent name because he made purification for sins and he sat down at the right hand of God. It also mentions that the Father is the one who's going to give the Son or the Christ, who we know to be Jesus, the designation of the Son and raise him above the angels. But also, the Son is better than Moses. And if you remember from chapter 3, the Hebrew writer is really going to make a big deal about Jesus or the Son being faithful as a son over the house of God, while Moses was faithful as a servant in the house of God. Also, he has inherited all things by conquering death and freeing us from fear and slavery. And we saw that towards the end of chapter 2. But in that whole conversation is the idea of the Son, how do you say it? The Son being made lower than the angels, but also that he did it willingly. And because of that, he was made or can be considered a faithful high priest because he's been beset with the same weaknesses as us, so he can sympathize with us. So, in doing this, he was also glorified, and our passage from Psalm 8 says that he was glorified and honored, but he was glorified and has been put over the house of God. Now he can sympathize with us as humans, being that he was willingly made like us in all things, being that he put on flesh and was made human. In this act, he has made us brothers and sisters and created a path to bring us to God in eternal rest. And this is really the crux of chapters 3 and 4, and how God wanted us to remain faithful and to be obedient so that we didn't follow the same paths that the people of the old covenant, and when they were out in the wilderness and they went astray in their hearts and they showed themselves to be disobedient and unfaithful to God by not believing not just in what they could do as a nation, but believing in what God could do through them. And so the Hebrew writer encourages us not to fall short of entering the rest. So we must stay faithful in the word of salvation that was spoken by the Son, the Lord, Jesus Christ. So beginning in chapter 1 and in chapter 2, also in chapter 4, the the idea is the Son is still speaking. The Lord is still speaking. Now, don't listen to the words of the angels. Don't listen to the words that were spoken through the prophets, but rather listen to the Son, because He's the one who has the word of salvation. He is the Christ. He is the Messiah. He is the high priest. So He's the one we're supposed to listen to on our journey to the eternal rest that God has prepared. He tells us we can draw near to Him when we need help, grace, and mercy. And all of this is because Jesus gave Himself up, because He chose to become like us so that He could bring many sons to glory and that we could be honored alongside of Him. So that's what Hebrews 1 through 4 is about. So as we get into chapter 5, he's really going to lean into another Old Testament passage in Psalm 110. It's Psalm 110 and verse 4. We've already seen 110:1, where we're seeing that the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And that's a part of the glorification of Jesus. But another side to Jesus, you might say, or another aspect of Jesus, is that he is the high priest. And we've already seen in chapter 2 how he was made high priest, but he's going to go a little bit more into what the actual priesthood looks like that Jesus is a part of. So go ahead and dig in with me in chapter 5 and verse 1. For every high priest taken from among men is appointed on behalf of men in things pertaining to God, in order to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. And we've seen this kind of language before, this in things pertaining to God, back in chapter 2, where it says that Jesus is our high priest in things pertaining to God. But here he's just making a general statement about the high priest, and more specifically about the physical high priests that existed under the old covenant. They were taken from among men, and they were appointed on the behalf of men in things pertaining to God, in order to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. So without the high priest, your sins would have stuck to you for all eternity. And so you had to have this mediator, this go-between, who would be able to, in verse 2, he can deal gently with the ignorant and misguided, since he himself also is beset with weakness. You may notice some of this language back from chapter 4 in verse 15. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. Therefore let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. So now he's stepping back a little bit and saying, okay, I've talked to you all about the high priest who was ours, the Son who gave himself up, but let's just talk about high priests in general. They're beset with weaknesses. They have weaknesses themselves, and so they're able to deal gently with us. They're able to sympathize with us. Those priests under the old covenant. But something that's interesting here. This word that's translated as misguided, planao. It's also the word that's used. Let's see if I can get back there without skipping it. Back in chapter 3, where it says in verse 10, therefore I was angry with this generation and said, they always go astray. They always go planao. These are the misguided. They're misguided in their hearts. And so he's bringing us back to that idea in chapter 5, that the high priest is able to deal with people who are misguided. He's able to deal with people who've gone astray, because they also go astray. And in verse 3 he says, and because of it, because they also are misguided, because they are also ignorant, they have this weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifices for sins, as for the people, so also for himself, because he's misguided, because he's weak. But also we saw back in chapter 2 that Jesus had the same weaknesses. He had the same things beset on him. And so in verse 4 it says, and no one takes the honor to himself, but receives it when he is called by God, even as Aaron was. So also Christ did not glorify himself so as to become a high priest, but he who said to him, you are my son, today I have begotten you. So we're seeing some of the same terminology brought up from the beginning of the book of Hebrews, this honor and this glorification. If you would, look back in chapter 2. It's a quotation that's coming from Psalm 8. Back in chapter 2 and verse 7, I'll start. You have made him for a little while lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor. So when he was crowned with glory and honor, that was really the designation of becoming the high priest. Him about to go through all of these sufferings, about to go through the temptations, being made lower than the angels as a man, as a human, and eventually having all things subjected to him. But first he has to receive this glory and this honor of being the high priest. See, let's get back to chapter 5. So he didn't take on the honor by himself. He didn't take on the glory by himself. Just like the people under the Levitical priesthood, he had to be called to be the high priest of a better covenant, of the covenant we're under. So Also, Christ did not glorify himself so as to become a high priest, but he who said to him, he who spoke to him, is the actual word. And this is one of our key words here in Hebrews, the word spoken. Just as it was spoken through the prophets to the fathers, now a son speaks to us, and so the Father is speaking to the Son, and he says, "You are my Son, today I have begotten you." And this is our Psalm chapter 2 passage. Just as he also said in another passage, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." And this is Psalm 110 and verse 4. And we'll talk more about this order of Melchizedek as we go through the book of Hebrews. He'll really get into it in chapters 6 and 7. But let's look over at our sheet. What is the role of the high priest? Well, he's supposed to deal gently with the people. He offers gifts and sacrifices for sins. That's what the high priest was supposed to do. So he can sympathize with the people and offer gifts, and he can deal gently with them because he can understand them. So in verse 7 it says, "In the days of his flesh," talking about Jesus now, or to use the terminology that's here, the Christ in verse 5, where he's called the Son also in verse 5, "in the days of his flesh." And this goes back to what was said in chapter 2, when he was made for a little while, or made a little lower than the angels. That's the days of his flesh, when he put on flesh and became like us. He offered up both prayers and supplications with loud crying and tears to the one able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his piety. Now, let's talk a little bit more about application here, where we've been following some of these key words throughout Hebrews, and we see words like save and heard. What did it mean for the people to hear? When we look back earlier in Hebrews chapter 3, I believe, verse 16, "For he provoked him when they had, for who provoked him when they had heard." Verse 7, taken from our passage in, Psalm 95:7. "Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as when they provoked me." So, listening to the words that are spoken to us from the Son, the words that are spoken under this new covenant, but the word they heard did not profit them because it was not united by faith in those who heard. So, today, if you hear his voice, and we find this word again down here in verse 7, he was heard because of his piety. What does that mean for us? Jesus was heard. The people under the old covenant, when they heard the word, they didn't unite it, or rather, they weren't united in faith in their hearing. It's important that we are true listeners of God, that we are trying to figure out not just what God's will is for us in this world, but remember that there is a rest for those who are real listeners, for those who are real hearers, because we're not just interested in what's happening here on this physical earth with these physical high priests, but we have this high priest who's above those who can sympathize with us. We have a great high priest who's passed through the heavens. So our hearing is much more important than the hearing that the people under the old covenant did, because we have a better message. We have the one who is better than Moses. We have the one who is better than the angels. So if Jesus is heard because of his piety, you think we should listen to the one who listened to God, or was listened to by God, rather? So he made prayers, supplications, loud crying, and tears. And you can go back through Jesus' ministry, and you can see all of these things play out. Um, and he asks, I believe it's in Mark, for the cup to pass, and it says he was heard, but does he get the answer that 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 he essentially prays for? He prays for the cup to pass. Now, the cup doesn't pass, but he's still heard because of his piety, and he's called or given the designation of high priest because he went through with the Father's will. He's given the designation as son and as king and as Messiah because he follows through with the Father's will. He's heard in his prayers and in his supplications. He's not given what he's asked for in the physical form, but he still heard because of his piety. So in verse 8, although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. And this really goes back to what we've been talking about throughout Hebrews, specifically with looking at the people under the old covenant, where it's quoted in Psalm chapter 8 that they were disobedient and therefore they weren't able to enter into the rest. So he learned obedience. It wasn't something that was just natural to him, even though he was the son. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. And for these Hebrew Christians, this is a message that's really going to hit home for them because, well, they're going through suffering as well, and we'll get more into that in chapter 10. And they're being tempted not to suffer. And so, the Hebrew writer makes a big deal about the son, the high priest, going through these times of suffering. And because he went through it, he can sympathize with us. So he had to learn obedience himself. And having been made perfect, he became to all those who obey him. So we have these two words that mean to obey him, to all those who obey him, the source of eternal salvation. So he was praying to the one who was able to save him, but because he went through with the suffering and he was obedient and he was made perfect, basically he died. He died and was given or given his inheritance of all things, which we'll talk about in chapter 1. Because he went through all of that, because he was entrusting himself and praying and making supplications to the one who was able to save him from death, he became the source of eternal salvation. You see how that happens? Because he was talking to the one who was able to save him, and the one who was able to save him from the things that he was fearful of or didn't want to go through necessarily, he became the source of eternal salvation because he went through with it. That's what makes him a great high priest. That's what makes him better than the angels. That's what makes him better than Moses. That's what puts him above or over the house of God. And it's not just any kind of salvation, it's an eternal salvation. And this gets back to the eternal rest that God has prepared for us. He's the source of the eternal salvation that will put us into that rest. So, what do we have to do? We have to listen. We have to hear the one who's speaking to us because he is the one who is the source of eternal salvation. And because he's the source of eternal salvation, what does he speak? Look back in chapter 2. How will we escape, verse 3, if we neglect so great a salvation? After it was at the first spoken through the Lord, it was confirmed to us by those who heard. So, this is a sure thing. This is something that is definitely going to happen. The Son or has prepared a place for us. He's speaking to us about this rest that we all get to enter into. This rest that is eternal salvation, and he's the one who spoke it, and it was confirmed to the writer of Hebrews by those who heard. God also testifying with them. So this God who's testifying with them by signs and wonders and by various miracles, was the one who had the power to save the high priest, who had the power to save the Christ. And so he's the one who put the Christ, the one who's going to speak this word of salvation to us. So back to the end of chapter 5, or towards the end of chapter 5. Let's see. Oh, I'm still in chapter 4. That would explain it. So he's made perfect. He dies and is given all the things that were promised to him. He's obedient, and he's made the source of eternal salvation, being designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. So let's talk about this order of Melchizedek briefly, and we'll talk about it a lot more later. This order of Melchizedek means that Melchizedek was a priest of the Most High God, but he wasn't in the lineage of Abraham or of the Jews. He was a Gentile. And so when you go back to Genesis chapter 14, you find that Abraham, or Abram at the time, is going to be blessed by Melchizedek. The greater is going to bless the lesser. And so when Jesus is called a priest or a high priest, according to the order of Melchizedek, Jesus is also blessing the lesser. And specifically, when you go back to chapter 2, there towards the end, chapter 2 and verse 16, for assuredly he does not give help, talking about Jesus, does not give help to angels, but he gives help to the descendants of Abraham. So Jesus being, or the Son, the Christ being a priest in the order of Melchizedek, he's giving help to the descendants of Abram, the descendants of Abraham, like Melchizedek blessed Abraham, or Abram, back in Genesis chapter 14. So there's a lot more to say about that, and the Hebrew writer will even say that here in a second. But let's get back to our sheet here on the left. Number 2, where is the writer getting the words honor and glorify? We answered that a little bit earlier there in chapters or verses 4 and 5 of chapter 5. He's getting that from Psalm 8, or you can say Hebrews chapter 2, where it talks about him being honored and glorified back in chapter 2. He's taking that from the passage in Psalm 8. Number 3, the Son being a blank in the order of blank makes him better than the Levitical priests. So this conversation about Jesus being better is going to continue into even the rest of the book. So what is he better than already? He's better than the angels. He's better than Moses, but also he's better than the Levitical priest, because he's outside of that priesthood and he's able to bless more than what that priesthood was able to do. But also in him being the priest, or the high priest, we'll learn a little bit later, and it's talked about back in chapter 1 and chapter 2, that he gave himself up. And he's not offering the sacrifices of anything else, any other animal. He gave himself up, which is why in verse 8 of chapter 5, you see that he learned obedience through the things that he suffered. Verse 7, there was one who was able to save him from death, and this death is the death of himself, and he's going to give himself up. And then he's going to be perfected and made the source of eternal salvation for those who would obey him. Again, there's been a big deal made about being obedient and what that means to be obedient. It means that you're listening to the Son, that you're following his edicts rather than that of the angels, that of Moses. So, what's our next one? Number 4, being in the order of Melchizedek requires the priest to bless the lesser. Or you can say the seed of Abraham or Abraham, whichever one you choose. See, I have a little note there to go back to 2:16. I think we already went back there, but I'll do it again. For assuredly he does not give help to angels, but he gives help to the descendants of Abraham, or to the seed of Abraham. Let's see, next question, number 5. A priest in the order of Melchizedek is also a king, and a high priest. Well, let's just say king for the sake of argument here in chapter 5. So Melchizedek literally means king of righteousness, or king of peace, which is what Melchizedek is going to be called back in Genesis chapter 14, and even later in the book of Hebrews. So a priest in the order of Melchizedek is also a king. Melchizedek was a king, he was also a priest, and Jesus, or the Son, is also a priest and a king. Number 6, the sequence of events for verses 8 through 10. He is made, he's made the Son in verse 8. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. He became, to all who would obey him, the source of eternal salvation. So he became the source of eternal salvation. He learned obedience through what? Through suffering. He learned obedience through suffering. And then he made blank through suffering. Or he was made blank through suffering. He was made perfect, or he was made complete, your translation may say. Then he became source of eternal salvation, or salvation. And back in chapter 3 and verse 1, it says that he's the author and the perfecter of our faith. So he's the source of salvation, the author and perfecter. And then he was designated high priest. So he's the Son, then he has to be perfected, he has to suffer, and then he's finally going to be designated as high priest. Let's see. All right, so we've caught up to where we are in Hebrews chapter 5, verse 11. Some people take this to mean that he's talking about Melchizedek. Concerning him, we have much to say. And it is hard to explain since you have become dull of hearing. But if we take this idea of hearing back through Hebrews, he's not talking about Melchizedek. He's talking about hearing the Son, because it's the Son who's speaking. So concerning the Son, concerning the high priest, we have much to say. And it is hard to explain since you have become dull of hearing. And if they're dull of hearing, what are they doing? Let's see. Yeah. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. So if you're not hearing, you are hardening your heart. And if you're hardening your heart, then you can't listen to what the Hebrew writer, or he says us, whoever us is, whatever they have to say, you're just not ready for it because you're not growing, because you don't have this Christ-centered understanding of the Old Testament. For though by this time you ought to be teachers, you have need again for someone to teach you the elementary principles of the oracles of God, and you have come to need milk and not solid food. So everything that he's been talking about here, he's saying, you need to understand that all of these passages in the Old Testament are really about Jesus. And when he's talking about making someone a priest in the order of Melchizedek, or a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek, those are things that, those are just basic. I can't move on with you all because you're so stuck on the elementary things. You're stuck on the beginning things of the oracles of God. And when he talks about the oracles of God here, he's talking about the Old Testament scriptures, and they're stuck on the elementary principles, or they need someone to explain the elementary principles to them again. He says, and you've come to need milk and not solid food. Solid food are the things um, that are beyond the milk, of course, but they're also for the mature, as he's going to say in verse 14. And so, when we're talking about Jesus being a priest in the order of Melchizedek, there's a lot more to it, but he's not going to get into it with them right now. For everyone who partakes only of milk is not accustomed to the word of righteousness, for he is an infant. And this word of righteousness seems to be tied to what he says down here, with those who were trained to discern good and evil. But solid food is for the mature, who because of practice have their senses trained to discern good and evil. If you cannot discern good and evil, if you're still, being disobedient, if you're still being unfaithful, then that means that you are still stuck on the milk of the word, and you're not accustomed to the word of righteousness, which is the solid food that is for the mature. So let's look at our questions. If they are dull of hearing, they are still hardening their hearts. And what are the elementary principles of the oracles of God? The beginning teachings about the Christ in the Old Testament, or just a Christ-centered view of the Old Testament. And what is solid, or what is solid food? Those are the words that will be able to train you to discern good and evil. To discern good and evil. All right, so that's chapter 5 in a nutshell. We went through it rather quickly, and there's a lot more that we could say here, especially with Melchizedek, but some of that has to be saved for later, because he's going to talk about it a lot more. But I think the crux of chapter 5 and putting chapters 1 through 5 together is that there's a or a central message of Scripture. And that message is about Jesus Christ and what Jesus Christ has done for each and every one of us in becoming the high priest, in becoming the Son, in becoming the King, in becoming the Messiah, in becoming better than the angels, in becoming better than Moses, in making purification for sins. And because Jesus did all of those things, because he fulfills all of those roles, we need to listen to him. The world has a message. For them, the Old Testament had a message, and it seems that there may have even been a little bit of angel worship going on, because he has to elevate Jesus above them. So with all of these things in mind, we need to understand that the entirety of Scripture is about the Son. It's about the one who's going to be crowned king. It's about the one who's going to give himself up after he's beset with weaknesses in putting on the flesh and becoming like us. But he did it also that he could understand us, so that we could know that we could go to him for mercy and for grace and for help, because he is a priest in the order of Melchizedek, and he will bless the lesser, just like Melchizedek did with Abraham, or with Abram. So let's make sure that our hearing is in tune with Scripture, but also when we're reading the Old Testament, realize that it's always pointing forward to someone, and that is Jesus Christ. So as we get into chapter 6 next week, go ahead and read chapter 6, and you'll hear me say a lot that some of these things are just bad chapter breaks. So as we get into chapter 6, one thing that I want you all to remember is that it all goes back to here. Because there is a high priest that's taken from among men, who's appointed on behalf of men in things pertaining to God. He's able to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. And so when you get into chapter 6, he's really going to focus on things that needed to be left behind. And one of those things is that old priesthood. So I hope you've enjoyed this study, and I look forward to getting into it even more. I plan on today recording chapter 1 for those of you who haven't already heard it. So I hope you all have a blessed day, and I will talk to you all later.